Hello, we are back with Chapter 11, Part 1. This is Dr. DeShavo, as always and forever. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. We're moving into neural function, and this is a complicated chapter, but this is like my favorite. I love the nervous system. But once again, I'm trying to teach you an entire course in a couple of videos. So if something is not clicking or not making sense, shoot me an email. What we're going to start off with in this first part is neural tissues. So we are starting off with neural anatomy and physiology. Let's talk about what a general overview is. And I do have there what makes us work. It's entirely fascinating to me after going on 20 years of teaching anatomy, physiology, and pathophysiology. What really makes us work? What is that extra spark that makes this nervous system function? It's just truly fascinating to me. And, we don't really know what that spark is, but we do know what some of the components and some of the physiology is. And that's what we're going to talk about. So with the nervous system, the basic gist of it, it's so complicated, but the basic gist is sensation, processing, response. Sensation will be either visual, touch, pressure, hearing, processing, all this information together. All that information goes up to the brain where that is processed together in multiple areas of the brain, and it travels on different pathways getting there, and then there's a response. So we're bringing in our external information, we're processing it in the brain, and then our body responds to it with some sort of motor response. I'm sitting looking at my computer, I'm processing all my previous experiences, I'm trying to think about how best to tell it to you, and then my mouth starts flapping. There you go. So the three components. So it's sensory, brain, motor. Brain and spinal cord will be the central nervous system where things are processed. Peripheral nervous system is your sensory and motor transmission. Sensory comes in, motor goes out. That's the general gist of it. So I think of the brain as your CPU, your processing unit. Your spinal cord has a little bit of processing, but the main gist of the spinal cord is almost like train tracks for a train. It sends the signals in and out of the brain out to the periphery, wherever that may be it face, be it body. Your peripheral nervous system is where the nerves actually go to and from the periphery of the body, and that can also be head and neck as well as body and torso and extremities. So the first thing that I'd like to talk to you about, and this is very difficult to learn. So once again, as you're going through this, if you have any questions, jot them down. I'd be happy to answer them for you. But I also find with nervous systems, sometimes it's best just to repeat this information a few times. So the whole gist of neurons or nerves is to transmit impulses. And these impulses are bioelectrical. Basically, if you think of them as being electrons, almost like the electrons that are sent through the wires of your electrical system in your house. We send these electrons along nerves to send these impulses out to the body and also to bring sensory information in. So any sensory information that comes in or motor responses that go out are basically electrical impulses that run along nerves. Okay, and we're going to go through the steps of those electrical impulses in just a few slides. Neurons do not have the ability to divide. They're amitotic. This is why if we damage neurons, let me explain this. In the central nervous system, if we damage neurons, we cannot create new ones, okay? In the peripheral nervous system, we can regenerate nerves. So if a nerve is sliced apart, for example, my cousin sliced her finger, and the nerve in her finger was sliced apart. And I said to her, you need to go get that suture to bring the ends of that nerve together so it can regenerate. Because in the peripheral nervous system, we can regenerate nerves if we can get the nerves close enough together. She didn't. So they didn't approximate the ends of that nerve, and now she has permanent sensory loss in that finger. So if we're talking about peripheral nerves, not central nervous system, which would be your brain and spinal cord, if we get those peripheral nerves close enough, they can actually regenerate. Our central nervous system cannot. And it's because of the type of nerves that we have in the central nervous system versus peripheral, which I'll talk to you about in a few slides. Now, plasticity is a new thing that we've been talking about. And plasticity means that in the central nervous system, specifically the brain, if we damage some neurons, which can't be regenerated, we can actually have surrounding neurons will assume the function of those damaged neurons. And that's called neuroplasticity. Our brain can kind of pick up the slack for damaged nerves and create new pathways from undamaged neurons that can actually pick up the function of those permanently damaged neurons. It's called neuroplasticity. So a severed spinal cord will result in paralysis below the area of damage. And we'll get into the specificities of that in a little bit. So that can lead to either paraplegia or quadriplegia. And I'll tell you exactly what levels cause which in when we get into actual disease processes. But keep in mind, the spinal cord also cannot create new nerves, and it cannot repair damaged nerves. So if we have trauma, tumor, accident, severing of the spinal cord, anything below that will lead to paralysis and loss of sensation. If we have damage, tumor, trauma, stroke in the brain, same thing will happen. The brain and the spinal cord, and also the peripheral nerves, but really where it comes into play as being a real issue is in the brain. It requires a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. So we have a system in place called glucose sparing, where we will actually save all the serum glucose that we have left. So suppose somebody goes into severe hypoglycemia. Glucose sparing will save whatever glucose we have left and send it to the brain so the brain can keep functioning, because the brain is the main man. If the brain goes, the rest of our systems go. So glucose sparing is saving all excess or leftover glucose in severe hypoglycemia to go to the brain, to keep the brain functioning. So when we're talking about neurons themselves, we'll have neurons which have the same basic structure. You'll have an axon, which projects information away from the cell, and it has myelin around it, which will make it white. We have dendrites, which are projections that transmit impulses towards the cell body. It does not have myelin, so it tends to look gray. And then we have the cell body itself. So let's actually jump ahead. So this is a picture of a neuron. And a neuron is the functional cell of the nervous system, both central and peripheral. So it's a functional cell that will actually transmit signals. It sends sensory information, it sends motor information, and it will process information. There's many different types of neurons. We're just going to look at this one as sort of a composite or an example neuron. So if we look at the cell body here, this is going to have a nucleus, which will process information. Coming into that cell body are all these dendrites. And these bring information from a multitude of areas to the cell body to tell the cell body what's happening. So you might have an axon, which is processing sensory information coming from our extremities. So these dendrites allow multiple information to come into the cell body for processing. The information is processed and it says, oh, there's a mosquito, somewhere on our lake. That'll send that information along an axon, which sends that processed information down to, say, muscle fibers, so you can create a muscle response. And there's millions of neurons sending and receiving information all the time. But that's the general gist of information. So we'll have dendrites bringing information to the cell body, which will process it. And then that information will leave that cell body by an axon, and that axon will go to some sort of receptor or another nerve. So it has muscle fibers here, but realize this axon can go to a multitude of receptors. Could be another nerve, could be a muscle, could be a gland. This is just a general overall explanation of the parts of a neuron or a nerve cell. Now, an axon in general will have myelin around it. And this myelin, I'm going to show you here, and then we will go back to the other slide that we were just going over. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here's a small segment of an axon. And once again, there's your cell body. So dendrites have brought some sort of information to the cell body, and the information is leaving by this axon, taking information away. That's how I always remembered an axon. Axon away, they both begin with A. And axons have myelin around them. And you could see this myelin here, and it almost reminded me, when I was learning it, of a hot dog roll, but a hot dog roll that goes all the way around the axon. And the reason it's important to know about this myelin is because it increases the speed of transmission down this axon exponentially. It goes from like 2 meters per second to 200, the axons. So depending on what type of nerve we're looking at, like if we're looking at, a nerve that's dealing with a reflex, and a reflex is something that we have in place to create a quick response, it'll have a lot of myelin on it. If we're looking at a nerve that goes to the digestive system, which is a slow moving system, it'll have a little bit of myelin on it. But the thing to remember is that myelin is only on axons. So myelin will be in place in areas that will be sending or transmitting information away from cell bodies. Okay. And you can see one final note, sorry. This is a nerve, and this is the myelin around that nerve. We're looking at it on end on that picture to the right. I just wanted to explain that there. Okay, and remember that myelin increases the speed of transmission down an axon. Okay, so neurons, the functional cell of the nervous system, has axons which transmit impulses away from the cell body. Dendrites brings it to the cell body. Axons are myelinated, dendrites are not. So the myelin sheath, which is around most axons, okay, it'll increase that transmission of the electrical impulses down it. So here's an interesting thing. We have myelin in the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system. They're created by different supporting cells. So not only do we have neurons in the central and the peripheral nervous system, we also have cells that are called glial cells, G-L-I-A-L. Okay, and I think I'm going to pop that in there because glial cells or neuroglial are supporting cells that help to nourish and protect neurons. Okay, so some examples of these glial cells are Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. And Schwann cells create the myelin in the peripheral nervous system, and oligodendrocytes create myelin in the central nervous system. And the reason I'm bringing these up at this point is those two glial cells have different abilities to repair neurons. Schwann cells can repair peripheral nerves. So if you cut a peripheral nerve, so that's anything outside of the spinal cord and the skull, they can be repaired if the ends are brought together because of these Schwann cells. And if you remember, I told you those Schwann cells create almost that hot dog roll around the axon. Those Schwann cells will create a bigger hot dog roll down that will actually engulf the broken ends of the neuron and allows them to get closer together and repair themselves. Something went wrong with oligodendrocytes, and this is the big question. If we knew what went wrong with oligodendrocytes, we could learn how to repair it. Those oligodendrocytes also create tubes for axons in the central nervous system, but if you damage or break the neurons, oligodendrocytes don't allow them to regenerate. So for some reason, it just was a mistake. Somebody went wrong there, right, in our creation, unfortunately. So they're trying to do research where they're taking Schwann cells and put it in the central nervous system along with stem cells in order to help create and promote that regeneration. Okay, so once again, this is the structure of a neuron. That is the myelin, and this is the myelin specifically with Schwann cells, just so you know. There's a different presentation with oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. Okay, so make note, this is with the Schwann cell creating the myelin in the peripheral nervous system. And that, my friends, brings us to a little question time. Which cells can help repair nerves? So is it Schwann cells, oligodendrocytes, neurons, or central nervous system supporting cells? Go ahead and give me that answer, and I'll see you after you do that. We're going to continue on with neurons. So with neurons, if we actually start to look not microscopically at neurons in the small parts like the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon, if we start to look at brain matter itself, so if I pull a brain out of a sheep and I cut it in half, you're actually going to see white and gray matter. And it's important to understand this because white matter is bundles of myelinated nerves and gray matter is bundles of unmyelinated nerves. Okay? And with white matter, this is primarily going to be axons, and this transmits information. Okay, so if you look at areas of the brain that have white matter, it's going to be areas that transmit information, as opposed to gray matter. And this is true in the brain as well as the spinal cord. So this will be dendrites and cell bodies, and this processes information. Okay, so anywhere you look at either the brain or the spinal cord, if you have white matter, that will be areas of axons, and that will be myelinated parts of nerves, I should say. And then gray matter will be bundles of unmyelinated parts of nerves. Okay. Once again, your book puts these notes out, and sometimes when I am going over them, I think it could be phrased just a tad better. Okay, so, all right. So what will happen is when you start to look at the sending of information down a neuron or a nerve, it's electrical. Okay, and I'm going to go over those electrical steps. It's called an action potential. But the basic gist is you're going to have one nerve talk to the next. And between them, you'll have what are called neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters will be substances which will be transmitted from one nerve to the next. You could also have neural information sent from a nerve to a receptor. So, for example, if you are sending electrical impulses down a nerve that goes to a muscle, you'll have a neurotransmitter that goes from the end of that nerve to that muscle. If you have a nerve which is going to a gland, because there are some cases of that, most of it is blood transmission of hormones, but there are some nerves that goes to glands. You'll send an electrical signal down that nerve and then a neurotransmitter to that gland. So between the nerve and the receptor, so it could be a nerve to nerve, it could be nerve to muscle, it could be nerve to gland, you'll have a synapse. So before that synapse, it'll be presynaptic. Don't let this blow your mind. Think about it. It's just before the synaptic cleft or space, you'll have a presynaptic terminal and a postsynaptic terminal. So presynaptic will be the nerve. Postsynaptic will be whatever that nerve is talking to. Muscle, gland, another nerve. In between them, you'll have a synaptic cleft. I'm going to go over this several times with pictures. So just listen and review it a couple times, okay? In that synaptic cleft, we will send neurotransmitters, okay? Don't worry about presynaptic. Don't worry about this terminal bouton or, some of that. Okay, so presynaptic, synaptic cleft, postsynaptic. And the neurotransmitter is what's going to talk between them. Let's look at a picture of that. Okay, so you're going to have an electrical signal come down this axon. So a dendrite talks to a cell body. Cell body is going to send an electrical signal down that axon. That axon's electrical signal is going to something to make it work. Muscle, another nerve, gland. So it's going to be an action potential. Let's just talk about it as an electrical signal comes down. It gets to that presynaptic membrane. We release neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters will talk to this postsynaptic membrane. Okay, and then this space is called the synaptic cleft. In their example, they gave you as a dendrite. So once again, whatever this receptor is, could be another nerve, which would be a dendrite, could be muscle, could be gland. I keep repeating things with this because I know this is confusing. So if this is something that's, familiar to you, I apologize. Be a good review. If it's not, I review it several times. Now, what happens as this action potential comes down, basically what is released is there's little vesicles, and these contain this neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter comes down to this presynaptic membrane, and it'll, by exocytosis, if you remember that, leak out into the synaptic cleft, and it'll attach to receptors on that postsynaptic membrane. And I actually have another picture to go over it. I want to make sure you got it because it's confusing. Gray and white matter in the brain. Okay, so once again, I told you axons are myelinated. They're white matter for the most part, and there are some exceptions. There are some dendrites that actually are in that white matter, but I'm just going to give you a generalization. So wherever we see white matter in the brain, we're transmitting information. So it could be from the brain to the body, right? Or the body to the brain. That's basically the general gist of white matter. Or it could be from right to left hemispheres. Okay, so white matter will send information to the body, or from the body to the brain, or to the both sides of the brain. Okay, gray matter is going to process information. So, and there's a multitude of how we process information that we'll get into. So we see gray matter on the outside. Then we'll actually see gray matter deep inside too. Generally in the brain, we have gray matter on the outside, almost like the thin skin of an orange around the entire brain. and then we have white matter in this center portion, but then deep in the brain again, we'll have gray matter that processes information. And we're going to get way more into this. This is just a general information, once over kind of thing. Okay, so once again, we have electrical impulse coming down the axon. It releases neurotransmitters from the presynaptic membrane. It travels across the synaptic cleft to receptors on that postsynaptic membrane. Okay, just want to make sure that you get that. Now, this electrical signal, and this is going to be in the next slide, is going to be an action potential. Okay, I'm going to go completely over the steps of an action potential. Don't let it blow your brain, okay? I'm going to go over the basic steps. But basically, an action potential is the movement of electrons across a cell membrane that makes a nerve or muscle work. Okay, don't let it blow your brain. That's it. It's just like we have electrons that move through our wires that make our electrical system work, okay? So this electrical signal that comes down the axon is going to be an action potential. We're going to go into the steps of an action potential in the next couple of slides. Okay. And this is a great place to take a break and go get a big fat cup of coffee. And we're going to go over these electrical impulses known as action potentials in the next few slides. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thank you very much. Take care.